When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Comics YouTube channel. Today's video is actually going to be a little bit of a character analysis, looking at their life and all of that. Now, this is a big spoiler warning. This will contain spoilers for what happens at the end of the Dance of the Dragon, some of the events that happen during it. So again, if you do not want House of the Dragon spoilers for what potentially will happen on the show, I would stick clear of this video, because this is going to be talking about kind of the ending effects of that conflict and also what follows. So, with that being said, this video is going to be all about Aegon III, or Aegon the Younger. He gets this nickname for being, well, of the two Aegons at this point of history. So you had Rhaenyra and Daemon's child, Aegon. He was younger than Alicent and Viserys' Aegon, so he kind of got the nickname of Aegon the Younger, while Aegon II, who we see in the House of the Dragon, is named Aegon the Elder. But before we get deeper into this character analysis, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do it up, share, grow, people that might like this content as well, and let's get into it. So, the big thing I want to talk about here with Aegon the Third, because he eventually becomes king, is he is one of the most depressing characters in the entire book. His life is very tragic. He experiences events that scar him and his reign. It is amazing to me to see his character as he progresses, because there's really no joy in really any part of his life until closer to maybe the end of it, and maybe the beginning. But let's take a look at where Aegon's situation was when he was first being brought up. So Aegon is the first child of Daemon and Rhaenyra. We see him a little bit in House of the Dragon, not much. There's a scene where they're introducing their two kids to Viserys, but we haven't really seen him yet. And he's not a major character within the actual dance. It's more or less the conclusion that he's used quite a lot. But he is someone that bonded a lot with his brother Viserys. So Viserys is their second child with Rhaenyra and Daemon, and they name him after Rhaenyra's father Viserys. And these two grew up in the same room together. They were very close early on in their lives. And that is kind of all that's really needed to know about Aegon before the Dance of the Dragons breaks out, is that this relationship is something that's very important to establish, because it'll affect something later. So as the war starts going and things start happening, we see that Rhaenyra's mental state continues to get worse and worse throughout the entire war. And Aegon sees all of this. Aegon is with his mother at all points of this war, right? He is always with her, especially after Luke's death. So Luke is Rhaenyra and quote-unquote Laenor's child, or if you're going to go off the show, it's more that it's Harwin's child. This is the child that dies to Vhagar and Aemond in the finale. Rhaenyra starts to become much more protective of her children and starts to become much more into inaction and not putting her children at risk. And that's the case with Aegon. Now, Aegon, something that's very interesting to think about with Aegon, especially with his what happens to him later on and his decision-making later, does have a dragon at this point. He does not ride his dragon, but one time, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the war kind of proceeds and keeps going, and because of how dangerous this conflict has been, and we see, again, another big spoiler for House of the Dragon, blood and cheese. We see how children that are innocent are not exempt from this conflict. They are, at risk of dying at all times. Jace, at this point, has kind of taken command of the Black's forces kind of at Dragonstone and the planning there, while Daemon does his stuff in the Riverlands. Jace says, okay, let's take Aegon Viserys, let's, take them to Essos, get them into safety for now. And so he does that. So Aegon and Viserys are loaded up, they're going to go to Essos, and unfortunately, they are intercepted by the Triarchy. Now, the show has not really done a great job of introducing who they are, but they're kind of the main driving force behind the War of the Stepstones, so this is really bad. So the Triarchy attack this ship, and luckily, Aegon gets away. But here's the downside, and the part that I think would crush any person. Aegon had to abandon his brother Viserys on this ship. And for many years, it is believed that Viserys dies at this point. So Rhaenyra takes this as, okay, another one of my children is dead. Aegon, who one of his closest friends, and he was very close with Viserys, was dead, and he believes he abandoned him. And not only that, he was kind of terrified trying to drive his dragon back to Dragonstone, that it was more or less he just kind of hunched onto the back of his dragon, and the dragon took him where he needed to go. So maybe we could infer that this was some sort of mind thing with the dragon and the Targaryens in the book, where maybe it was just, the dragon knew where Aegon needed to go, and that's all that really needed to happen. But this event causes a really big thing to happen. Aegon now, at this point, is never far from his mother. Rhaenyra sees how she's losing her children like flies, because directly after this event, Jace kind of looks to avenge his brother, and he ends up dying. So now at this point, you really have 2 children left for Rhaenyra that she knows of, right? Because Viserys doesn't actually die, and we talk about that a little bit later in this video. But she still has Joffrey, who at this point had been sent to the Vale to kind of protect them. He ends up getting called back to King's Landing. Aegon does as well. So Aegon and Joffrey now are in King's Landing after Rhaenyra takes it. And to this point, Aegon's just never really the same. He feels the incredible weight and guilt of leaving his brother behind. And when you're seeing your mother's increasingly worse mental state, especially in King's Landing is where it gets to its peak, it does a lot. And also, when you see that Joffrey dies at the whole riots of the Dragon Pit, Aegon now becomes, for the Blacks, the heir to the Iron Throne. He becomes the person now that's going to ascend the Iron Throne. He's watched all of his siblings now at this point die, or at least he thinks they are dead. And his mother at this point is just crazy. Like, she's just not in the right mental state. She's going through deep depression. She's not fit to be the person in charge of the Blacks at this point. It's very traumatic for Aegon. That's something he carries on for a while, and he definitely goes into a deep depression, especially after the end of the conflict. But what ends up happening after Rhaenyra loses King's Landing is she ends up taking refuge at Duskendale for a little while with Aegon, and they go to Dragonstone. Now, we know that once they get to Dragonstone, we know that Aegon has already taken it. He had been missing for quite a while, and I meant Aegon II, not Aegon III. Aegon II had been missing for quite a while, and he had been on Dragonstone. So he's at Dragonstone. We see a injured version of Sunfire, and we see Aegon II. And Aegon III watches as his mother is eaten whole by Sunfire. And this also builds his growing hatred of the dragons. I think I forgot to mention, but earlier on, when he comes back to Dragonstone after the incident with the Triarchy and his brother getting quote-unquote killed, his dragon actually dies as well. So Aegon has now watched his dragon die after he abandons his brother, basically, in his mind. He watches his mother get eaten by a dragon. So this all compounds into why Aegon later on in his reign becomes very anti-dragon. He stops putting dragon eggs in, children's baby cribs, and this is a really big thing. So instead of Aegon III being killed, for now, Aegon II decides, let's keep him. He's a good hostage against the Blacks, and we can use that. So for now, Aegon is basically kept as a prisoner and is sent back to King's Landing, and that is where he will await for quite a little while. And once he gets back there, we start to see that the people start playing the Game of Thrones again. So Corlys is someone that at this point is willing to make peace. He had been telling this to Rhaenyra to make peace, and she did not listen. So what basically Corlys says is, okay, Aegon II, I will bend the knee, but what you have to do is you have to marry your daughter to Aegon and then make him the heir. Right? Now, Aegon II obviously doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want Rhaenyra's line to end up anywhere near the throne. He wants her line to die out. And that is just not a very popular opinion, because the way you end the war is unite the two sides. So this is a very good plan by Corlys, And even Larys Strong, so this is Clubfoot, foot fetish guy, he basically starts manipulating people. He manipulates Alice into agreeing to this. He manipulates Aegon into eventually doing this. So eventually, what ends up happening is, one way or another, Aegon II is killed. So Aegon II is poisoned, we believe. And all while this is going on in the city, Aegon II is refusing to bend the knee or make any sort of peace because the Tully force, led by Kermit Tully, our boy, is outside basically with a force, and the city at this point is under siege. So basically, he's poisoned because he's just being a shitty king and really not understanding his circumstances and wanting more death and war to happen. So after Aegon II is killed, Corlys takes Aegon III out with a banner of peace, and this is really where Aegon is crowned as the new king, right? So Aegon is now kind of proclaimed, and the Blacks, quote-unquote, win the war. Really, neither side wins this war because both sides are basically completely destroyed. You have very few people left. I mean, again, if we look at the green side of it, their line is only continued through Aegon and Helena's daughter, while the black side is only completely through Aegon. We know later that Viserys is also still alive, and he'll come back into play a little bit later. But at this point, a very dangerous time for the Targaryens. If somebody wanted to kill off the Targaryens, this would be the time. But this is what ends up happening one way or another. Aegon does eventually end up marrying Aegon II's daughter. I'm forgetting her name at this point, but it's not really that relevant to what we're talking about right now. Now, to get on to Aegon's actual reign, he didn't actually reign over anything for quite a while. He was only 10 when he came into the ascendancy of the throne, so he is not really seen as fit to rule the realm yet. He had a council of people that did rule. And something I want to really focus on and talk about is the political corruption that went on during this time period, as people were fighting over who was going to be hand. We had a number of different people who ended up being the hand in this short amount of time. At some point, Cregan Stark takes over King's Landing and starts executing people for their involvement in the murder of the king before, Aegon II. Aegon III, all while, is basically helpless in this and basically watches the execution. So again, more horror, basically being kept a prisoner in his own castle. Very traumatic start to his reign. But again, he really wasn't seen very much, right? People began to become very unhappy with him because he just wasn't really ruling, right? He just wasn't seen. He was not old enough to really be in full control yet, and this really wouldn't kind of change for quite a while until a certain event happens, that coming to age, and also the return of one of his better friends, Viserys Targaryen. Before we get to that point, though, I want to talk a little bit more about the corruption that continues even after Cregan Stark leaves the capital. The new hand of the king ends up being Lord Peake, and this is helped from Maester Munkin at the time. And Peake was a very bad hand of the king. He was someone that was kind of very similar to Otto Hightower, where he was trying to gain power. Aegon was not officially able to rule yet on his own right, so Peake was basically ruling the realm. Aegon wanted things to happen. He would name people to the Kingsguard. He would name, this and that, and Peake would undo it and would go over the top of his head, right? And this caused a lot of issues, right? If you're Aegon, because you're sitting here just helpless, right? You're trying to make these decisions. Everyone's going against you, and you can see the corruptness in your own government, your own establishment. And this even gets worse when you have Aegon's only friend at this point was someone named Gaemon Palehair. Let's go with that. And what would end up happening is if Aegon didn't go along with what Peake wanted, Peake couldn't really, harm the king. He couldn't harm Aegon, but he could harm the king's friend, and he became basically a whipping boy. And basically this was just a way of manipulating Aegon because, obviously, a kid at this age getting whipped, you're going to be hearing his tears, his blood. It was enough to just kind of turn Aegon to basically allowing Peake to do what he wanted to do. And it's just another way of trauma, mental abuse that Aegon goes through in his early life that really changes him as a person. And this only gets worse. So, as we talked about earlier, Aegon had been married to Aegon's daughter, Aegon II's daughter. So I know it's a lot of Aegons in this story. And her actual name, I looked it up just for this part, Jahara, she dies of suicide. So again, this is a rumor. We're not exactly sure if she was murdered or not. It seems most likely that it was suicide. Aegon now watches his wife commit suicide. Now, they were never really close, but still, this is a very traumatic thing. I mean, if you think about it, let's say you were, okay, so Aegon III, very young at this point. Let's say you're in 8th grade or wherever grade level school when you're younger in whatever country you're in, and you hear that somebody killed themselves in your grade, let alone your wife. That's a very traumatic thing, and it's just another layer to Aegon III's unhappiness and his trauma. And again, we see a lot of parallels to Otto Hightower here, as immediately Lord Unwin Peake tries to get his own daughter, Muriel Peake, to be the one that is going to be married to Aegon III. Most of the lords disapproved of that match, which again, you can see for obvious reasons. And this kind of leads us to the Maiden's Day, which is basically this whole thing where Aegon III's sitting here, and he's basically just judging these women and whether he wants to marry them. And the person that ends up taking Aegon's heart is Daenerys Velaryon. Not Daenerys, close, Daenerys Velaryon. She was only 6 years old at the time, so this was a little awkward, just based on the fact that it's a 6-year-old, but, you know, we do some weird things in this story. But this did seem to make him a bit more happy, and what follows is not another happy moment for Aegon, is that his brother, Viserys, is found. Adam Velaryon, on his journeys, ends up finding Viserys, and basically, one way or another, Viserys ends up returning to King's Landing. Now, this completely brightened Aegon's spirits, and another thing that was interesting that kind of went against Lord Peake is that his friend Gaemon, that we talked about a little bit earlier, he kind of becomes forgotten. It comes back to being Aegon and Viserys being the two. And another thing to build upon with also Gaemon being forgotten is that his queen was now neglected. So Aegon was not the best person in the world, but we understand why he finally gets his brother back. A bunch of stress and guilt relieved off of his shoulders. He gets to be back with his brother, and he just forgets about his queen, basically. It's basically the gist of it. He pretty much just forgets about her. So we now see where Aegon and Viserys kind of come to age. It's kind of their coming to age story. And this is kind of the end of people just kind of manipulating Aegon and him not being able to rule. So basically, we kind of come to this state where the Peakes kind of try to take over, and it's just not going to fly. Aegon basically calls upon all of his banners, and more or less this little siege, quote unquote. For the time being, Aegon after this sets the new Hand of the King as Grand Maester Munkin, and as I've talked about, very interesting decision if you look at the Grand Maester conspiracy, because if you look at Munkin was one of the people involved with putting Peake into power in the first place. So he was actively working as Targaryens, but he also then ends up being Hand of the King with alone. He has the power of the entire realm at his fingertips until about half a year later when Aegon comes to the throne, like in his own right, because he hasn't come to the throne yet. There's still like a little bit of time there where Munkin is the hand by himself. And I also want you guys to remember that at this point, the dragon eggs weren't really hatching. If they were hatching, they were coming out with very suspicious-looking dragons that weren't dragons that never literally lived very long or were just very small. So again, very interesting point. And also something that was really big with Aegon is that he was not a supporter of the dragons. He did not like the dragons, and we can see that by his earlier life. His mother dying, his dragon dying. He is not someone, and he lives through the entire Dance of the Dragons and comes out. Very few people in that situation do come out of the Dance of Dragons, and he sees the horror that they do cause. Even though Aegon did find some happiness with his brother coming back, he just wasn't a very good king. He was someone that dealt with a lot of depression. He didn't really involve himself much in the rulership of the realm, even after he became king. He just it's basically known that he locked himself in his room to brood for days on end. He just wasn't a good king. And I think what this really points to is how great of a hand Viserys ends up being and how well he does at governing the realm. So I would like to give a lot of credit in this video to Viserys, who ends up becoming king for a very short time later on. But Viserys really is the person in control of the kingdoms and not Aegon at this point. But that is something to really talk about with Aegon, is that all of these things finally broke him later on in life. And it even is said that it took 10 years for Aegon to consummate his marriage. Now, this to me does make sense. If you look at his wife was 6 when they were basically married. And then the next thing to talk about on Aegon and what children and legacy leaves. His wife, Daenerys Velaryon, births 5 children: Daeron, Baelor, Dana, Rhaena, and Elena. And this led to Prince Daeron being named the Prince of Dragonstone. And with the help of Viserys Targaryen, Aegon's brother, they ended up putting down certain pretenders, like someone that claimed to be Daeron Targaryen. So this is the brother of Aegon II and of Aemond in the normal story, who we'll see in season 2 of House of the Dragon. But yeah, they put down that, and through a long time, through his reign, again, like I talk about, the dragons end up dying during his reign, and he does do a last attempt, basically urged by his brother, to try and bring the dragons back with 9 mages from Essos. Doesn't work, like we know, and he ends up dying of consumption in 157 AC. And let's talk about what succeeded Aegon III, and what should we take away from Aegon III's reign. What ends up following is that Aegon's son, Daeron and Baelor, both die. They both become king. They die. They don't have any children. And then the crown passes to Viserys. Now, Viserys was the key person ruling. Viserys really rules the kingdom for, I think, 40-ish years. He is pretty much the person in charge, even though he's not king. And even when he becomes king, he's only king for a very small amount of time, which is something that is very unlucky, because he would have been a fantastic king. But that's kind of Aegon III's legacy in a nutshell. And if we look at Aegon, he's just a very tragic character. Someone that quite possibly could have been a good king if he hadn't experienced a lot of the experiences that he goes through. Seeing his mother die, seeing his mother really go insane for the most part. Thinking he abandons his brother and just, leaves him to die. I know that one kind of gets changed towards the end, but you think about how many years he lived with that knowledge. Basically him always being a prisoner in his own castle, or this or that, whether that be with Cregan Stark, whether that be with Peake, whether that be with Aegon II when he had him. He was someone that very much was almost felt like he was a prisoner. Even with Rhaenyra, right, his mother always kept him very close to her. And he just felt like someone that never really had a chance to live a fulfilling and cool life. He never really got to explore and live out, a really cool life. I think Aegon's life is very tragic the way it kind of goes. If you even look at his first wife, it isn't someone that he wanted to be his partner. And even then, she kills herself. So it is a very tragic situation for Aegon, where you can just tell he didn't really find much enjoyment in his life. And yeah, so thank you guys for coming along on this journey of talking about Aegon III. He's a very fascinating character. And I hope they kind of plant those seeds in House of the Dragon of where his character is going to go. But to me, a character that is very much overlooked, and I think a lot of people do not like Aegon III's reign and kind of the after effects of the Dance of the Dragons in Fire and Blood, but it is a part that I really do like. It plays a lot into the Maester conspiracy with kind of the shadiness of Aegon III's reign at times, and I really enjoy it. So thank you guys all for watching. This is a long video, I know, so hopefully you guys kind of enjoyed it a little bit, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.